The gunshot was a splinter of sound that shattered the bank's drowsy afternoon quiet. Iris Conancade flinched the ink from her pen, bleeding into a dark spiderweb on the withdrawal slip. Men shouted. A woman screamed a raw, terrified sound that was swallowed by the crash of an overturned table. Dust and the acrid smell of spent gunpowder filled the air. 3 men, their faces masked by grimy bandanas, stormed the Wagenspoor Territorial Bank. 2 herded the tellers and customers into a corner with menacing efficiency, while the third, a man of brutal size and authority, vaulted the counter. He moved with a predator's purpose, ignoring the stacks of currency in the open drawers. His eyes, cold and dark above the cloth, scanned the room until they landed on Iris. He pointed a gloved finger. "You. The widow." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the numbness that had been her constant companion since James's burial. The man rounded the counter and grabbed her arm, his grip like a blacksmith's vice. He smelled of sweat whiskey and something metallic like old blood. He dragged her toward the vault, his boots scuffing a trail in the fine red dust that coated everything in Wagenspoor. "The manager," he growled, shoving the terrified, balding Mr. Abernathy toward the massive steel door. "Open it." Abernathy fumbled with the combination, his hands shaking so violently. The clicks of the tumblers were erratic and desperate. The heavy door swung inward with a groan of protesting hinges. The robber shoved Iris inside, into the cool, still air that smelled of paper and metal. He ignored the shelves of cash boxes and bags of coin. His gaze was fixed on the wall of brass-fronted safe deposit boxes. "Number 73, he commanded, his voice a low rasp. Iris's blood ran cold. It was her box, James's box. How could he possibly know? Abernathy, using a master key and a second key from a ring on his belt, opened the small door. The robber reached inside and pulled out the slim metal container. He pried it open with the tip of his knife. Inside lay 2 items, the folded crisp deed to the Conancade claim, and James's silver watch, its chain coiled around it like a sleeping serpent. It was a beautiful piece, a repeater chiming the hours and quarter hours, a gift from her father on their wedding day. The man snatched the deed and stuffed it into his coat. Then his gaze fell upon the watch. He picked it up, the heavy silver gleaming in the dim light of the vault. A long, jagged scar that ran from his left eyebrow to the corner of his mouth tightened as his lips twisted into something that was not a smile. For a moment he seemed to forget the chaos outside, mesmerized by the object in his hand. He clicked open the watch's cover. He didn't look at the time. He simply held it, his thumb stroking the smooth, cool metal. "Some debts are paid in silver," he sneered, his voice low and laden with a meaning that chilled Iris to the bone, "others in time." He pocketed the watch, snapped the empty deposit box shut, and shoved it back into its slot. He turned and grabbed Iris's arm again, hauling her out of the vault. His men were already backing toward the door, and their sacks heavy, but not, Iris noted with a strange sense of clarity, overflowing. They hadn't come for the bank's money. They had come for hers. At the entrance, the leader paused, holding Iris in front of him like a shield. He stared directly at her, his eyes burning with an ancient, inexplicable hatred. Then he shoved her forward, sending her stumbling to the floor as he and his men disappeared into the dust and chaos of the street. Iris lay on the hard wooden planks, the splinters pressing into her palms. The screams and sobs of the other customers faded into a dull roar in her ears. She wasn't thinking about the robbery or the money or the danger. She was thinking of James's watch, now nestled in the pocket of a violent stranger. She instinctively reached for the place on her bodice where she had once pinned it for safekeeping, her fingers finding only empty fabric. The loss was a physical ache, a fresh wound laid over the deeper unhealing one of his death. The robbery wasn't random. It was a message. And the cold certainty settled in her heart that this was not an ending, but a violent, terrifying beginning. The walk back to her cabin at the edge of town was a journey through a world that had tilted on its axis. Wagenspoor was a town of stark, brutal contrasts, a truth the robbery had only sharpened. The acrid smell of coal smoke from Abner Lyle's new silver refinery, mixed with the clean, dry scent of desert sage, a constant battle between industry and nature. Splintered boardwalks, groaning under the weight of ore carts, ran past the mercantile, where women in faded gingham haggled over the price of flour. The raw new money from the mines glittered in the saloon, a stark counterpoint to the quiet desperation of the downstream farmers whose crops withered from poisoned water. As Iris passed the Grand Hotel saloon, she saw him, Abner Lyle, holding court on the veranda. He was immaculate in a tailored suit, a diamond stick pin winking in his cravat. He was laughing, buying a round of whiskey for his foreman, his voice smooth and confident. A farmer, his face a mask of weary despair, tried to approach him, gesturing toward the discolored creek that ran behind the town. But Lyle waved him away, with an irritated flick of his wrist, never breaking the flow of his story. His greed was a tangible thing, a force that was reshaping the very land around them. Inside the saloon, through the swinging doors, Iris caught a glimpse of another man. A stranger seated alone at the far end of the bar, nursing a single whiskey. He was a study in stillness, his trail-worn clothes a stark contrast to the rough finery of Lyle's men. His face was weathered, carved by sun and hardship, and his gaze missed nothing. He observed the room with a wary, intelligent stillness that spoke of a man haunted by his past, a man who understood the geometry of a threat before it ever took shape. For a moment, their eyes met across the dim, smoky room, and Iris felt a flicker of something she couldn't name. Not recognition, but a shared understanding of solitude and survival. She hurried on the dust of the street, clinging to the hem of her morning dress. Her cabin, small and sturdy, was the only thing James had left her, the only thing that was truly hers. But without the deed, it was just wood and nails on land that belonged to no one, or worse, to anyone with the power to take it. The shadow fell across her doorway, just as she was lighting the lamp with the last of the afternoon sun bleeding away behind the mountains. Abner Lyle stood there, his bulk filling the frame. He had removed his hat, a gesture of mock respect that was more insulting than an open threat. "My dear Iris," he began, his voice dripping with the false sympathy he had perfected since James's funeral. "I heard about the unfortunate incident at the bank. A terrible business. It only confirms what the Territorial Council has been concerned about." He stepped inside without invitation, his expensive cologne overwhelming the cabin's simple scent of dried herbs and wood smoke. "A woman alone, you see." He continued pacing the small space, as if assessing its value. "It is a dangerous world. The Council, in its wisdom, has passed an amendment for the protection of vulnerable widows and the proper stewardship of valuable territorial land." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "It is a simple matter. Any unmarried woman inheriting property of significant mineral value must remarry within 3 months of her husband's passing, or the land reverts to territorial stewardship." He was framing it as a benevolent offer, a law designed for her own good. But Iris saw the predator behind the smooth words. She had heard whispers of this new law, but had dismissed it as cruel gossip. "My husband has been gone 3 months to the day," she said, her voice a tight wire. "Indeed," Lyle purred. "A terrible coincidence. Which is why I am here, to relieve you of this burden. I will offer you a fair price, more than fair, and you can relocate to a safer, more suitable town." Iris stared at him, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The law, the timing, the robbery. He knew the deed was gone. He was moving in for the kill. And the robbery, Mr. Lyle, I suppose, that was also a coincidence. A flicker of something annoyance perhaps crossed his face before being smoothed away. Tragedy seems to follow you, my dear. First your husband's accident, and now this. A string of bad luck. He knew. The casual mention of James's death, the way his eyes held hers, it was all a part of the pressure. He was telling her he was in control. This was the moment. The precipice. She could fold cell and run, or she could fight. Grief had hollowed her out, but it had also left behind a core of hard, unyielding resolve. James had worked this land, bled for it. It held the last echoes of his laughter, the ghost of his presence. She would not surrender it. "The law says I must remarry Iris," stated her voice, quiet but firm. "It does not say I must sell to you." Lyle's smile was thin and cold. "And who in Wagenspur would dare to cross me by marrying you, Iris? You have until sundown tomorrow." After he left the cabin, felt smaller, the walls closing in. Desperation was a physical weight pressing down on her chest. She had no family, no allies, and no deed. She had only one day to find a husband. And in a town owned by Abner Lyle, that was an impossibility. An image flashed in her mind. The stranger at the bar, his quiet watchfulness, the weary competence in his posture. He was an outsider, a man with no loyalties to Lyle, a man who looked like he could handle trouble because he had lived his life steeped in it. It was a mad, desperate gamble, a leap into an unknown abyss. But it was the only move she had left. Clutching the last of her household money, Iris walked back into the heart of Wagenspur, her destination, the one place a grieving widow was forbidden to go. The Grand Hotel Saloon. The plan that formed in her mind was scandalous, reckless, and her only hope. The saloon doors swung open, spilling a parallelogram of golden light and raucous noise onto the darkening street. When Iris stepped inside, the noise died as if a switch had been thrown. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Every eye in the room turned to her, a black-clad ghost in their smoke-filled sanctuary. She ignored the stares, the whispers, the palpable shock. Her gaze scanned the room and found him still at the bar, nursing what might have been the same whiskey. She walked toward him, her boots making a solitary, determined rhythm on the floorboards. She stopped beside him close enough to feel the weary stillness that radiated from him. He turned his head slowly, his gray eyes assessing her with a calm, unreadable expression. She didn't have time for pleasantries. She didn't have the strength for deception. All she had was the raw, unvarnished truth of her desperation. "I need a husband," she said, her voice low but clear in the unnatural silence. "In name only. It's a business arrangement." The stranger's eyebrow arched a fraction. A flicker of interest, perhaps, or just surprise. He took a slow sip of his whiskey before answering. "Ma'am, you might have me mistaken for a different kind of man." "I need your gun," she clarified, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "and your signature on a marriage certificate. There's a man, Abner Lyle, who wants my land. A new law says I lose it if I'm not married by sundown tomorrow. I'll pay you. $100 in gold. You can be gone by the morning after." His gaze sharpened, moving past her to the other men in the room, noting their discomfort, the way they avoided looking at Lyle's empty table. He understood power dynamics. "Jude Ransom," he said by way of introduction. His voice was a low drawl, weathered as the rest of him. "What kind of trouble are we talking about, Mrs. Conincade?" she supplied. "The kind of trouble that gets a bank robbed for a single property deed. The kind of trouble that gets a law written to steal from a widow." A glint of something that might have been respect appeared in his eyes. He seemed to weigh her words, not just for their content, but for the steel behind them. Before he could answer, a chair scraped loudly nearby. It was Dr. Tally Lyle's personal physician and sycophant, his face flushed with drink and indignation. Mrs. Conincade, this is hardly a respectable display. He slurred, rising unsteadily. In your delicate condition, one must question your state of mind. Jude Ransom's body tensed a subtle shift, but the air around him grew colder. His hand moved to rest on the table inches from the worn grip of his Colt. The lady is engaged in a private conversation, Jude said, his voice quiet, but carrying the unmistakable weight of a command. Dr. Talley was too drunk or too arrogant to heed the warning. She needs a husband, does she, perhaps? She should have considered Mr. Lyle's generous offer instead of accosting strangers in a public house. Iris saw her chance a desperate, wild gambit. This couldn't be a quiet arrangement. It needed to be a public fact, an undeniable spectacle that the entire town would witness. She met Jude Ransom's wary gaze. "He's right," she said, her voice rising to carry through the room. "This needs to be public." Then louder still, she declared, "I need witnesses, and I need them now." She looked Jude straight in the eye, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was about to burn every bridge, every shred of her reputation on this one desperate roll of the dice. But the memory of the robber's sneer, the weight of James's stolen watch, fueled her recklessness. She would not be erased. The night was a blur of hurried arrangements and tense silence. Jude, with a pragmatism that seemed to be his defining characteristic, escorted her to the office of the Justice of the Peace, Wilbur Hatch. They were followed by a procession of stunned onlookers and two unlikely witnesses. Porter Vance, the quiet shopkeeper who had finally found a grievance worth defying Lyle over, and Agnes Farweather, the town schoolteacher, a woman whose rigid sense of propriety was apparently overridden by her even stronger sense of justice. The ceremony was a stark, loveless affair, conducted under the flickering gaslight of Hatch's cluttered office. Iris paid the justice with the last of her savings. Jude stood beside her, a silent, formidable presence. He smelled of trail dust and leather, a scent of the wild, untamed world she had just invited into her life. When Hatch pronounced them husband and wife, the words felt unreal, a strange legal fiction spoken into the dusty air. They walked back to her cabin under the cold gaze of 1,000 stars, the whispers of the town following them like ghosts. The small cabin, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage she had to share with a stranger. An unspoken tension filled the space between them. This was not a marriage of hearts, but a contract signed in desperation. "The bed is yours," Jude said, his voice flat. He dropped his saddlebags by the door and took up a position in the single wooden chair, tilting it back against the wall. He pulled his revolver, checked the cylinder with practiced ease, and laid it on his lap. He was a sentinel, a hired guard. Nothing more. Iris lay on the narrow bed, fully clothed, staring into the darkness. She was married to a man whose name she had known for less than 3 hours. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She had wagered everything on this stranger, this quiet man with ghosts in his eyes. The first rock shattered the window above the hearth. Glass exploded inward, showering the floor. Before Iris could even cry out, Jude was on his feet, moving with a silent, fluid grace that was terrifying in its efficiency. He kicked the chair away and flattened himself against the wall beside the broken window, his revolver in his hand. Another rock crashed through the second window. A chorus of drunken shouts echoed from the darkness outside. "Come on out, widow bride. Show your new husband a proper welcome." It was Lyle's men. "Stay down," Jude commanded, his voice a low growl. He didn't need to tell her twice. Iris crawled from the bed, pressing herself against the floorboards behind the heavy oak table. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Then she smelled it. Smoke. Acrid and thick. A dark orange glow flickered against the drawn curtains. The barn, she whispered, horror seizing her. James had built that barn with his own hands. It housed their milk cow and the chickens that were her only steady source of food. Jude swore under his breath. He peered through a crack in the door. 4 of them. They're trying to draw us out. The heat against the cabin wall intensified. The crackle of burning timber grew louder, punctuated by the panicked lowing of the cow. Rage, hot and pure, burned through Iris's fear. They were not just trying to intimidate her. They were trying to destroy her piece by piece. Jude made a decision. When I open the door, they'll expect me to come out shooting. They'll be focused on me. He looked at her, his eyes glinting in the firelight. You have a weapon. Iris nodded, crawling toward the cold hearth. She reached up and pulled a heavy, long-barreled shotgun from the hooks where it rested. James's gun. She had never fired it, but she had watched him load and clean it 100 times. Her hands were shaking, but she checked the breech. It was loaded. Good, Jude said with a nod of approval. Don't show yourself unless you have to. But if one of them gets past me, you use it. He took a deep breath, then kicked the door open and fired 2 shots into the darkness. Not at the men, but to the side, drawing their attention. Gunfire erupted from the night bullets, thudding into the log walls of the cabin. Under the cover of the noise, Jude slipped out the door, melting into the shadows like a wraith. Iris could hear shouting the chaos of a fight. A man screamed in pain, another gunshot closer this time. The orange glow of the fire cast dancing, monstrous shadows across the cabin floor. She held the shotgun, the cold metal a stark reality in her hands. This was her life now. A war fought in the dead of night for a piece of land and a measure of dignity. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sounds of the fight faded, replaced by the roar of the fire. Then silence. The cabin door creaked open. Iris raised the shotgun, her finger trembling on the trigger. Jude stepped into the light, his face grim, a dark gash on his cheekbone. They're gone, he said, his breathing heavy. For now. He looked past her at the inferno that had been her barn. The roof was collapsing, sending a geyser of sparks into the night sky. The cow was gone. Everything was gone. A wave of despair so profound it threatened to drown her washed over Iris. She sank to the floor, the heavy shotgun resting across her lap. All she had done, the scandal, the sham marriage, had only brought more violence to her door. Jude walked over and knelt in front of her. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. Then he reached out and gently took the shotgun from her hands. You did well, he said, his voice quiet. It wasn't praise. It was a simple statement of fact from one survivor to another. And in the smoldering ruins of her life, that small acknowledgement was the only thing that kept her from shattering completely. Their alliance, born of a desperate contract, had been sealed in fire and gunpowder. They were no longer just a client and a hired gun. They were partners in a war she was only just beginning to understand. In the gray, smoke-hazed light of dawn, the full scope of the attack was laid bare. The barn was a heap of blackened, smoldering timbers. The scent of burnt wood and something terribly final hung in the air. The attack had solidified their pact, but it had also raised a terrifying question. Why was Lyle so desperate? It couldn't just be about silver. This was personal, vindictive. This isn't just business, Jude said, echoing her thoughts as he surveyed the damage. This is a vendetta. We need to find out why. Their investigation began not with clues, but with people. Their first stop was Tohini's, the old Apache healer who lived in the foothills above the poisoned creek. Iris had known him for years, trading her baked bread for his knowledge of medicinal herbs. He was a man who saw the world in patterns others missed. They found him by the creek, his weathered face a mask of sorrow, as he examined a cluster of dead fish, their silver bellies turned up to the sky. He greeted Iris with a nod and sized up Jude with eyes that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. "He carries the ghosts of a war," Tohines observed, not to Iris, but to Jude himself. "But his spirit is strong." Iris showed him the vial of murky water she'd collected. "It's getting worse, Tohines." "It always does when greed drinks from the land," he replied. He led them to a hidden alcove behind a waterfall, a secret place where he kept his records. He had notebooks filled with meticulous drawings of plants, showing their slow wither and decay. He had charts tracking the sickness of animals and people, the dates corresponding perfectly with increased activity at Lyle's refinery. It was a damning chronicle of a slow, deliberate poisoning. Lyle kills the land to get the silver, but he does not see that the silver is worthless without the land that holds it. Their next ally was Agnes Farweather, the school teacher armed with a formidable intellect and a deep-seated belief in rules, had taken it upon herself to scrutinize every law and ordinance passed by the Territorial Council since Lyle's arrival. "It's here," she said, her finger tracing a line in a dusty legal tome spread across Iris's kitchen table. "The amendment he used against you. It was proposed by his cousin, a councilman from the capital, and passed in an emergency session with only 3 members present. It was specifically worded to apply only to unmarried female inheritors of lands with proven mineral value. It was written for you, Iris." The conspiracy was more intricate than she had imagined. It wasn't just brute force. It was a calculated strangulation using the very laws meant to protect her. As they pieced together Lyle's legal manipulations, Jude pursued a different line of inquiry. He spent his days in the saloons and stables not drinking, but listening. He had a way of making himself invisible, a quiet presence that men soon forgot. He learned that Lyle hadn't always been the magnate he was today. He'd arrived in the territory years ago, a young ambitious foreman with nothing to his name. The breakthrough came from Silas, an old dust-caked prospector with a memory as long as his beard. Jude found him nursing a cheap whiskey, and a question about Lyle's past unlocked a flood of recollections. Lyle. "Oh, I remember him. Cocky youngster. Worked for James Conincade, he did." Silas rasped, his eyes clouding over. Iris felt a jolt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. "He worked for my husband." "Aye. 5, maybe 6 years back. Before Conincade sold his first big mine and bought this claim here. There was another mine up in the San Juan Range, the North Star. Had a bad collapse, real bad." Silas took a long pull of his drink. "Killed a dozen men, trapped them deep. They never even got the bodies out." A cold dread began to creep up Iris's spine. She remembered James mentioning the North Star, but he'd always spoken of it as a failed venture he was wise to sell off. He'd never mentioned a collapse. They needed someone to blame. Silas continued, his voice dropping. Conincade was a big man, even then had friends in the capital. So the blame fell on the foreman. Young fella named Abner Lyle. Said he cut corners on the timber supports to save money. Ruined him. He disappeared after the inquiry. No one heard from him for years till he showed up here in Wagenspur with a new name and a pocket full of money. The room seemed to sway. Lyle had worked for her husband. Lyle had been blamed for a disaster at her husband's mine. This entire war, the law, the robbery, the attack, it wasn't just about her land. It was about James. That night, Jude's own past intersected with the mystery. As they sat in silence, the weight of Silas's story hanging between them, Jude spoke. "The North Star collapse. I remember it." Iris looked at him, startled. I was a young lieutenant then stationed out of Fort Garland, he said, his gaze distant. We were sent to keep the peace during the inquiry. It was a sham. The official report was too clean, too simple. We all knew it. The whispers were that Conincade paid a lot of money to make the problem go away. The problem, I guess, was Lyle. The image Iris held of her husband, a kind, ambitious man, a pillar of the community, was beginning to fracture. He was a man with powerful friends, a man who had sold a mine where a dozen men had died, a man whose history was directly violently entangled with the man trying to destroy her. Driven by a desperate need for the truth, Iris began to tear the cabin apart. James had been a meticulous record keeper. If there was a secret, there would be a record of it. She searched his desk, his clothes, the strongbox under the floorboards. Nothing. He had a workshop, she said, suddenly remembering a small locked shed behind the cabin that she hadn't entered since his death. He called it his office. The lock was rusted shut. Jude forced it open with the tip of his knife. The air inside was stale, smelling of dust and old secrets. It was filled with geological maps, assay reports, and stacks of ledgers. In a locked metal box tucked away beneath a pile of ore samples they found it. Not a ledger, but a personal journal bound in worn leather. James's handwriting filled the pages. With trembling hands, Iris opened it. Her eyes scanned the entries, her breath catching in her throat. It was all there. The mounting debts, the pressure from investors, the decision to use cheaper substandard pine for the support beams in the deep shafts of the North Star mine instead of the required oak. A calculated risk. James had written, "The vein will be played out in a month. The pine will hold long enough." But it hadn't. Iris read on, her world crumbling with every word. She came to the entry dated the day after the collapse. It was a confession written in a shaky, frantic hand. 12 men. God forgive me. They are entombed. Lyle's father was the shift boss. His younger brother, just a boy of 16, was with him. The boy wasn't even on the payroll, just helping his pa. Iris's hand flew to her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. Lyle's father and brother. The final pages were the most damning. James described in cold, clear detail how he used his connections and his money to shift the blame. He fabricated work reports. He bribed an inspector. He painted Abner Lyle as a reckless, incompetent foreman whose negligence had cost a dozen men their lives. Lyle is a nobody. James had written, "His name will be forgotten. Mine will endure. It is the cost of building a legacy." Iris closed the journal, her hands numb. The man she had loved and mourned, the man whose legacy she was fighting to protect, was a monster. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had orchestrated a cover-up that had destroyed a man's family and his life to save his own ambition. Abner Lyle was no longer just a greedy villain. He was a man twisted by a grief she could now understand. A man seeking a terrible, righteous vengeance. The land, the silver, the deed, they were just tools. His true goal was to obliterate the name of James Conincade, to salt the earth of his legacy. And she, by fighting for that legacy, had placed herself directly in the path of his righteous fury. The battle for the land was over. A far more terrible personal war had just begun. The revelation in James's journal shattered Iris. The grief she felt for her husband was now poisoned by the bitter truth of his actions. She looked around the small cabin at the sturdy walls he had built, the chair he had sat in, and saw not the loving husband she remembered, but a stranger whose ambition was paved with the lives of other men. Her fight against Lyle was no longer a simple struggle for survival. It had become a profound moral crisis. How could she defend the name of a man who had caused so much suffering? How could she fight for a legacy built on such a monstrous lie? Her resolve, once a pillar of fire, now felt like crumbling ash. When she walked through town, she could no longer see Lyle as a simple tyrant. She saw a man whose entire existence had been forged in the crucible of a tragedy her husband had created. She saw the ghost of a 16-year-old boy in his shadow. Jude watched her, his usual taciturn silence, now filled with a quiet concern. He understood the weight of a guilty past, the way it could anchor a soul and drag it into the depths. "This changes things," he said one evening as she stared blankly into the fire. "It changes everything," she whispered. "I'm fighting for a lie, Jude. I'm defending a ghost who doesn't deserve defending." "You're not fighting for him anymore, Iris." He countered, his voice steady. "You're fighting for the people downstream. You're fighting for Tohines and Agnes and the miller's little girl. You're fighting for this land, not for the name on the deed." His words were a small light in her suffocating darkness, but the guilt remained a heavy cloak she couldn't shrug off. Lyle, with his predator's instinct, sensed her hesitation. He began to change his tactics. He stopped the overt violence and started a campaign of insidious whispers. A tragedy, that North Star business, he would say loudly in the saloon, ensuring the right people overheard. Poor James Conincade. He never truly recovered from the shame of his foreman's incompetence. A good man ruined by the carelessness of others. He was testing the waters, planting seeds of the past, framing his own actions as the righteous anger of a wronged man. He was trying to turn the town against her, not as a greedy widow, but as the inheritor of a guilty name. Some in the town began to look at her differently, their support wavering, replaced by suspicion. The fight was no longer just against Lyle, it was against the ghost of her own husband. The sandstorm began as a faint yellow haze on the horizon, a smudge against the brilliant blue of the sky. The old-timers in Wagenspoor saw it and began shuttering their windows and securing their livestock. They called it a red roller, a force of nature that could strip paint from a wagon and scour a man's soul. It was under the cover of this approaching chaos that Lyle made his final move. He didn't send his men. He came himself. Iris was returning from Tohines's camp, a satchel of herbs in her hand, when he stepped out from behind a rock formation blocking her path. His face was a mask of cold fury, the smooth veneer of the businessman stripped away to reveal the raw, grieving avenger beneath. "We have unfinished business, Mrs. Conincade," he said, his voice nearly lost in the rising wind. He had a pistol in his hand, and his eyes held the terrifying certainty of a man with nothing left to lose. He forced her up the winding path toward the mountains, toward the one place this story could truly end, the boarded-up entrance of the North Star mine. The wind was a physical force, now whipping sand and grit into their faces. The sky had turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The entrance to the mine was a dark wound in the mountainside, exhaling a cold, damp breath, a forgotten tragedy. Several crates of dynamite were stacked near the entrance. "He left my father and my brother to rot in the dark." Lyle screamed over the howl of the storm. "He built his life on their bones. It's only fitting that his legacy dies in the same way. An eye for an eye, a mine for a mine." His plan was horrifying in its symbolic cruelty. He was going to put her inside, seal the entrance, and entomb her, erasing James Conincade's last living connection to the world. Just as he shoved her toward the dark opening, another figure appeared through the swirling dust. It was Jude, his face set like granite, his Colt in his hand. He must have followed them. "Let her go," Lyle. Jude's voice was calm, but it cut through the storm's roar. Lyle laughed, a wild, broken sound. He turned, dragging Iris with him. The wind tore at his hair, revealing the face of a much younger, more desperate man. And in that moment, as the sand momentarily cleared, a look of shocked recognition crossed his face. He wasn't looking at Jude as an opponent. He was looking at him as a ghost from the past. "You, Lyle," breathed his voice, a venomous whisper. "I remember you. The uniform. The lieutenant's bars." He pointed a trembling finger at Jude. "You were there. At the inquiry. You were one of the soldiers who stood there and did nothing. You watched him bury the truth. You watched him bury my family. You are just as guilty as he was." The accusation hit Jude like a physical blow. Iris saw the truth of it in the sudden anguish in his eyes. He had been a bystander, a cog in the machine of injustice that had crushed Lyle's life. His past, which he had carried in silent penance for years, had just been laid bare in the heart of a maelstrom. The climax was no longer a simple standoff. It was a three-way crucible of guilt, vengeance, and atonement. The sandstorm raged around them, the world reduced to this one desperate patch of ground. The unstable mind groaned under the pressure of the wind. "He was wrong." Lyle Iris shouted, her voice raw. "My husband was wrong. He did a terrible thing to you, to your family. I have his journal. I know the truth. She was no longer defending a legacy. She was confessing its sins. But killing me won't undo it. It won't bring them back." Her words in admission of her husband's guilt seemed to pierce through Lyle's rage. For a moment he faltered. In that instant, Jude acted. He didn't fire his gun. He lunged forward, tackling Lyle, not as a killer, but as a man trying to stop a cycle of death. They crashed to the ground, a desperate tangle of limbs. At that moment, a section of the rock face above the mine entrance, weakened by years of neglect and battered by the storm, gave way. A shower of rock and timber rained down. Iris scrambled back, pulling herself clear. Jude rolled away, but Lyle, momentarily stunned, was caught. A heavy support beam crashed down, pinning his legs. He screamed a sound of pure agony that was swallowed by the storm. The dynamite crates struck by falling rocks began to smoke. "Jude!" Iris screamed. Jude, ignoring his own injuries, scrambled back to Lyle, trying to free him from the wreckage. But the beam was too heavy. The fuses on the dynamite hissed, spitting sparks into the sand-choked air. "Get out of here," Lyle choked out, his face pale with pain and resignation. "It's over." Jude looked from the trapped, broken man to the hissing fuses, then to Iris. He had to make a choice. To stay and die attempting an impossible rescue, or to live and carry the weight of another failure. But this time was different. This time he was not a passive observer. "I'm not leaving you," Jude grunted, putting his shoulder to the beam, his muscles straining. "Go," Iris yelled, pulling at his arm. "We have to go." The choice was made for them. With a deafening roar, the dynamite exploded. The force of the blast threw them backward. The mine entrance collapsed completely, a final definitive tombstone of rock and earth. The storm raged on, as if trying to scour the very memory of the tragedy from the face of the mountain. The storm broke with the dawn. A fragile, clean light washed over the landscape, revealing a world scoured clean. The entrance to the North Star mine was gone, buried under 100 tons of rock. Abner Lyle was gone with it. Iris and Jude, battered and bruised, made their way back to Wagenspoor in silence. The physical ordeal was over, but the emotional wreckage remained. Lyle had been brought to a terrible justice, not by a gun or a noose, but by the very mine that had been the source of his family's doom. They sat at the kitchen table in the small cabin, the silence thick with unspoken words. The journal, James's confession, lay between them. Finally, Jude spoke, his voice hoarse. "He was right. I was there. I was 22 years old, and I knew what I was seeing was wrong. The official story didn't make sense. But I was a soldier. I followed orders. I stood by and said nothing." His face was etched with a shame that had clearly haunted him for years. I've been running from that moment ever since. Coming here, taking your offer. Maybe I was looking for a fight that mattered. A way to balance the scales. Iris reached across the table and placed her hand on his. You didn't stand by this time, Jude. You tried to save him. She looked at the journal at the testament to her husband's sins. The man she had married was flawed deeply and tragically so. But his story was now finished. Hers was not. The truth, as painful as it was, had set her free from the burden of defending a lie. The town of Wagenspoor, now aware of the full complex story of the Connecade-Lyle feud, began its own slow process of healing, no longer divided by a simple story of a hero and a villain, but united by the shared grief of a tragedy that had finally reached its end. Months later, Wagenspoor was a town reborn. The clean water flowing in the creek was a symbol of its recovery. But Iris knew that true healing required more than just clean water. It required atonement. The silver vein on her land, and the source of so much greed and death, was finally being mined, but under her strict direction. The profits were not hers to keep. She established the Wagenspoor Miners' Memorial Fund, its first purpose to provide for the families of the 12 men who had died in the North Star collapse, including a significant anonymous endowment sent to what remained of the Lyle family back east. The mine itself, once a symbol of her husband's ambition, was renamed. A simple wooden sign now stood at the head of the claim, the Memorial Mine. It was no longer a monument to one man's legacy, but to the memory of all who had been lost to it. The final act of closure came on a crisp autumn afternoon. Iris walked to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. She stood before her husband's grave, the simple headstone reading, James Connecade. For the first time she felt no anger, only a quiet, sorrowful peace. He was a man who had done terrible things, but his story was over. From a small velvet pouch, she took the silver repeater watch. Jude had found the man with the scar, the robber Elias Thorne, in a saloon 2 territories over. He had recovered the watch not with a gun, but with the story of the tragedy it represented. Thorne, it turned out, was a distant cousin of Lyle's, another soul set adrift by the North Star disaster, and had taken the job as an act of family loyalty. Iris placed the gleaming watch on the granite headstone. It was not a gesture of lingering love, but of release. She was leaving the past where it belonged. The beautiful, intricate object, a symbol of debts paid in silver and in time, no longer had a hold on her. A quiet footstep sounded on the path behind her. It was Jude. He came to stand beside her, no longer a hired gun or a husband of convenience, but a partner. He had found his own absolution not in running from his past, but in facing it and making a different choice. He gently took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. Together, they turned away from the grave and looked out at the valley, at the town of Wagenspoor, glowing in the golden afternoon light. They walked away hand in hand toward a future they would build together, one founded not on secrets and lies, but on the hard-won, cleansing truth. The end.